Hi, and welcome to the Fintan and Michel interview at Broadcast Asia 2018 here in Suntec in Singapore. It's 4:20 in the afternoon if you're watching this live, and it was 4:20 in the afternoon if you're not watching it live on day 2 at Broadcast Asia. So I'd like to introduce Michel Proulx, who has flown all the way from Ottawa to Singapore to present at multiple seminars and multiple speaker slots here at Broadcast Asia. Thank you for coming all the way from Canada.
My pleasure.
And so what I'm kind of curious, because Michel's capacity here, aside from being an industry veteran of more years than he wants to admit to, it really, if I can paraphrase, was something that we've been talking about. Michel is possibly considered as an evangelist of IP in the broadcast space. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I'm not sure I appreciate the religious connotation, because it's not a religion.
Well,
but
technical evangelist.
So I'm a big part of what I'm doing these days is helping this industry make that transition to IP and file-based, and so that's been a priority of mine for some time, and I love to evangelize, I guess.
Okay, so before we go into your what you've seen at the seminar and what you've heard at the seminar and what you kind of are soaking up in the Asia Pac space for the move to IP, it's probably important to explain your perspective on baseband technology and legacy technology and how well you understand that, because I think you have what many people would be quite jealous of is a deep understanding of what's there and a strong understanding of what's coming and how to get there. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your past for people who don't know you.
Okay, so it's interesting. You're right. I've been in this industry for 30 years. Most recently, I was at Miranda for several years, and of course, before I left Miranda, we were still in an SDI world, whereas now we're very much approaching this IP world, right? But now one of my big activities these days is I'm working with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. We're working on a fairly major facility rebuild, and we've chosen to do that facility rebuild in IP. So you're right, I do know the old world, the SDI, but I've had to learn the new world IP. So you're right, I do have an interesting position having lived both.
So, and this kind of feeds in, I suppose, to my kind of first question. You have been on multiple panels here at Broadcast Asia in the seminars and even some seminars just before the show started. One of the recurring themes in terms of migration to IP broadcast technology seems to be around people's skills.
The knowledge gap.
The knowledge gap. How important is that as a factor in? Because we're talking about technology, we're a technology show, but this is about people and people skills.
So it's interesting. You've selected exactly the point. I'd say at all the conferences that I've been at concerning IP at this show and in our panel that we had, the topic of the knowledge gap. So we're starting all this IP stuff. The broadcast engineers that are there, do they have the tools? Do they have the skill sets? And it's a gap, and it's going to be an issue. And most people, it's going to slow things down. So I think it's really important that this is being discussed, because the next step is it has to be addressed, right? So you yourself, you're doing this a lot. You're doing a lot of activity to try to help educate the industry. We've done some seminars that you've helped organize. I think it's hugely important. Education is hugely important. But I think another point, we were asked today, what's the timing of the transition? The panel was asked, what's the timing of the transition? And I think the timing is going to be different for different people. But no matter what your timing is as a broadcaster, it doesn't matter if your first project that'll touch IP is this year or 4 years from now. Because of the knowledge gap, you have to get involved in doing some kind of IP project, whether it's a lab or it's a little proof of concept or it's a small studio on the side. I think it's imperative that broadcasters start to fill up this knowledge gap by doing some real practical projects.
So and again, I'm thinking we have a mixed audience here. So obviously, there's probably a lot of broadcast engineers and a lot of IT engineers who come from different backgrounds. But in an average broadcaster today, you tend to have the core broadcast engineers almost in one department, and you have an IT department, and they got routers and switches. So are the broadcast engineers going to become part of an IT department? Are an IT department going to take over, or what? Or is this just something else?
Well, it's an excellent point. I think in a media facility today, it's often those two teams are siloed. They're very separate. And I think the first thing that has to happen is those silos have to be taken down. So that's either by building a cross-functional team, a single cross-functional team, or ensuring that those people are working on those projects together. The silo effect has to be removed if you're going to have any success. Those people have to start working together. And there was a gentleman that I met this week at the event that we were at on Monday that I think put it very well. So he's Australian. This is Charles. He's from Australia, formerly with a broadcaster, I believe it was Channel 9. He's now in the IT space. And he said something to me that was very interesting. First thing he said the same thing: break those silos, make them into one team, and then take your IT engineers that everybody says, all those IT engineers, they don't understand the urgency of broadcast. His solution, Charles's solution to this when he was back in Australia working for Channel 9, was to send those new IT engineers out into the field at OB events, not just one, but for several weeks or even a month of living that world, living the live world, so that the IT engineer suddenly becomes more sensitive to the pressures and the urgencies of the broadcast space. And I thought that was brilliant. I think that's a really good solution to this issue. And then I think the other thing is, it's where I got my, in French we say piqûre, where I got the bug of loving television, is by going out there and seeing what happens when it's live. You'll see that this is a fascinating industry that's got all this excitement, right? I remember I was at this live event. It was an election coverage, and the producer got really mad because the other network called the election before, and he kicked the garbage can and it hit the production switcher. You know what I mean? It's a live event. There's a lot of energy. It's a fun industry to be in. So I think the IT engineer can get that energy and can learn the urgency. So I think that's an interesting way. So don't just cross-pollinate the teams. Make them learn each other's trade.
I think it's a great point. It's something that I find interesting, given that we're in SI and we've just started doing live broadcasts recently, right. And we're actually surrounded by some of my engineers here who are not accustomed to being in a studio environment, which we're in now. So, and I can tell you, it gives them a different perspective. If the audio has problems, or if the video has problems, or if we lose a hand or a head magically.
So everybody thought this was an outside broadcast, and we're outside in Singapore. It's a green set.
You may have just realized that we're not actually on front of the background, but we're very close to the picture.
Could I have a mountain background, please, now? No, so it's back to the IP subject. Seriously, it's the transition will happen for different people at different times, right? There's lots to learn. There's lots of new technology. It's still a young transition. There's still some maturity that has to happen with the vendors. The vendor's solution have a ways to come yet. But to be honest, the end users, it's back to my story from before. They have to do a project now to learn it, but also to build a relationship with those vendors that are out in front of this issue.
Who's leading in this space? I mean, you're over here kind of talking about a lot of research that has been done in Canada for the national broadcaster there. In the US, in Europe, you travel, you do the global shows. Is the globe moving on the same clock here, or is this a North America first, Europe second, Asia third, or what's the timing here?
No, I don't. Okay, so I think let's tackle the U.S. versus Europe thing. Both of those groups are going at the same time.
We're in sync.
That's right. We just at the conference we were just at here, we heard about StarHub here, who have done a big install in Australia, the big NEP project, which is a very ambitious and interesting IP-based remote production, huge projects. So now this is going on all over the world, right? And I think it's not a US first kind of thing. I think it's the IP addresses certain needs, and if you have those needs, people are tapping into them. In NEP's case, they wanted to build this huge across the country network to be able to do remote production seamlessly.
Yes.
The only way to do that was to build it over IP, right? So they needed the scale and they needed the transparency of it doesn't matter where the equipment is and where the people are, it's one big production.
This segues into a very important question. So from the seminars that you've been involved in here, a recurring question was, what's the benefits, what's the reason to go IP? So what in order of priority, say what are the top three kind of key drivers that broadcasters should be motivating broadcasters to move to IP?
Okay, so first of all, we shouldn't be dogmatic about it. It depends on everybody's individual situations. But I would say the biggest benefits for doing IP today, I would say for us, the project that I'm doing, we are trying to move to a facility that previously was made out of a bunch of fixed function boxes that only did one thing, to a facility where as many of the components as possible are going to be software. Because what we want is the agility to be able to have more of one thing one day and less of that thing another day, and change what our infrastructure does, what our components do. So we want better agility. So that is the example that you gave, so that we can ramp up production because it's the Olympics, and ramp up a couple of extra channels and those kind of things. So it's to get that agility. That's the number one reason in my mind. And in order to get the software, you have to go to IP first. So we wanted to get the software, so IP is the one thing. The other one, so I'd say the number one is being able to go to software to give us agility. The second one I think is if your future and your immediate future involves a mixture of UHD and HD and maybe 1080p 50, what some people call full HD, you want a format agnostic facility. IP gives you that. It gives you that format agnosticism. So I'd say that's the second one, right? And then the third is only applies to a greenfield site. If you're going to be building a greenfield site, so brand new facility from the ground up, the amount of wiring that you have, is going to be dramatically reduced because of the use of IP. The fact that a single IP fiber is 100 gig fiber is carrying 60 videos in both directions, files, everything on the same fiber. The reduction in wiring is important.
So physically in your car room, your cable trays are smaller. You've less, and is that? So that's an initial cost. It's a wiring cost, but the maintenance thereafter as well. Now,
I think, and it's also a more future-proof. Laying down this kind of fiber that's got IP at both ends, the traffic that you put on that is not fixed. On that piece of fiber, you could be transporting live video or files, audio, Genlock, everything goes in through that. So it's a lot more. It's not I have to run some video wiring, some audio wiring, and some Ethernet wiring. I now run one piece of fiber, and that piece of fiber is carrying all of my kinds of traffic. So that wire now becomes more agile. I can change what I put on both ends and not have to change the wire in the future. So it's also more future-proof, I guess.
Okay, and this is in the facility. So I realize that we have to kind of top and tail this interview. But one thing in terms of we a couple of years ago we were talking about IP, kind of basically SDI over IP, and the SMPTE standards, and more functionality like auto discovery coming in as more SMPTE standards. So the benefits of migrating to IP are in a way kind of linked to the rollout of the standards as well. So where are we in standards rollout in terms of the stuff that's coming? How much more is it going to do for us? And is there an end to this, or is the IP story continually going to get better?
Okay, so I think that the standard story is a good one. So I think the standard story is better now than it was a year ago, in that we have SMPTE 2110, which is the transport standard, how we put video and audio on an IP network. That is now completely ratified. So we're good to go.
So that means the manufacturers now can target. They know what to deal with.
Exactly, and we're writing some RFPs, and we're able to ask for clear questions on the RFP, leaning on the standard. Where things are not as mature from a standardization perspective, and it leads a fairly big gap. This promise of auto discovery, so the standards that are being worked on there are from AMWA, and the series is NMOS, and the most important one is IS-04, which is the registration, and IS-05, which is for a universal connection control. Those two standards are still not complete.
So this is plug and play.
Plug and play, and be able to have any vendor of controller control any vendor of endpoint.
Okay, which is not the natural state for the broadcast business.
It's not the natural state for the broadcast industry. So those two standards, and I would say of those two, the registration and discovery, I would say in the project that we're doing, we're not worried about interconnecting, interoperability of devices from a signal point of view. 2110 is mature, we're getting that. But where we're struggling a little bit is it's quite complex to configure this system, and there isn't this automated way of once you configure it for all the components to know. And that's the job of IS-04, and we're not quite there yet. It's a gap, right? But it's a gap that's being addressed. But today it's a gap.
Okay, and taking a step back from kind of the low level standards and the function, taking a step back into the bigger picture, the future of broadcast. I see people oscillating between gloomy that Netflix is going to eat their business, or being excited that IP has made it cheaper to do live production and we can do much more live, and our local broadcasters are going to have an ability to create more content and manage it better than ever before at a lower cost. So what's the future for broadcast?
Okay, so actually it's funny, those are two separate topics, right? Yes. What's happening with the delivery of content to viewers and the consumption of content, which is, you're right, tending towards, whether you call it OTT or digital, whatever you want to call it, and that's what Netflix does. There's no doubt.
We're streaming live.
And we're streaming. So there's no doubt that that's the future of broadcasting. And I think that broadcasters need to look to those other outlets in the future so that they themselves continue to be relevant in the future, right? But in order to do that, in order to have that capacity to do all those new kind of services and spin up channels because it's the Olympics, or spin up channels because there's a big concert or whatever, we need to be able to do that. But in order to be able to tackle that new competition, we better have a facility that's a lot more agile. We can't build a production system today that will only do a few linear channels. We have to build a production system that will be able to evolve up and down as we do these different distribution activities. So I think it's essential to build a modern facility that is agile and software-based and can be reconfigured on the fly to better compete in the future.
Okay. I might add to that. I think this IP and this IP technology is coming in lots of shapes and sizes, and I think a lot of it is actually making the palette for the broadcaster wider and broader. So we're sitting here in front of essentially a one or two box solution that's giving us a pop-up studio, a pop-up channel. 5 years ago, we were sitting here to do this with $500,000 worth of kit and a control room and the whole lot. So, this isn't going to be for everything, but a broadcaster can afford to do this and do some high-end production at the Olympics or at the Asia Games or something like that. And I think this whole IP, literally, this is all IP. We're going out over bonded IP. It's a software solution on a COPS box, and it's giving more tools to the broadcasters to do more. So I like to think that it's an optimistic future.
Absolutely, and I think we're just at the beginning of it. And I firmly believe. I'm a hardware engineer originally by trade. Canadians will recognize my ring. I'm a hardware engineer, but I now firmly believe that we need to look at more and more at software-based systems, because that will give us the agility to do different things. And you're right, it's impressive that all of this is running from a very small setup compared to a few years ago.
I just thought of a last technical question because you're one of the most technical people I know, and you can explain technical things simply, which is what Einstein espoused to as well. Right? COTS, you have a strong hardware background, and people are talking about, you're now talking about the software, but we hear COTS a lot, and virtualization and cloud. So the hardware, is it better on COTS? Is it better virtualized, or is it better in the cloud?
Okay, well, so actually, to be honest, yes to all three of those. So first of all, I thought the question was going to be, what's my definition of COTS? Because
that was inferred in the question as well.
Okay, so to us, and this is, we talk about this almost every day. To us, COTS is a piece of equipment that we can buy from a vendor, and that vendor is selling that same piece of equipment to other industries. So in other words, that vendor, we're not their only market. So that's the first definition. Okay, so we can buy a piece of equipment that is being financed by a bigger market than ours. So that's the first thing. And then the second definition for us, COTS piece of equipment is one that we can use one day to do one function and use an exact same version of that same hardware to do another function from another vendor. So that now we have one piece of hardware doing 2 or 3 different functions. So it makes our purchasing easier, it makes our support contracts easier, it makes our spares easier, it makes all of it easier. So that's our definition of COTS, something that's coming from an industry bigger than ours and something that is multi-purpose. Okay. So it's very important. So now the second question you asked was software versus virtualized versus cloud. So for us, some functions are already virtualized. At CBC, our entire Avid environment is completely virtualized. Our entire audio production environment is completely virtualized. We're doing some testing with some software-based solutions for playout applications. We think we're going to be running those bare metal initially, right? So not virtualized, because they hog the whole machine anyway. It doesn't
There's
matter.
no benefit. There's no extra CPU to...
The fact that it's not virtualized doesn't take away from that same machine. If we don't need that channel anymore, we can take that channel software down and run something else on that machine. So it's not as quick as virtualized would be, but at least it's still multi-purpose. Okay? So software, bare metal, or virtualized depends on the function. Virtualized, why virtualized? Just to get better use of the machine, but also a function that we virtualize. We know if we need transcoding, for example, we do so much transcoding, we do all of it in-house because it's cheaper to do it in-house. But when we have a burst, because it's the beginning of the month and then we can burst out to the cloud with exactly the same situation. So having built that on a virtualized platform allows us to have internal capacity in-house and burst out to the cloud.
We've deployed solutions like that already. We're seeing that we've put in Elemental, the green servers, traditional hardware, and then some events come up and it bursts into the Amazon cloud, so you can see
that's flexibility, right? That's the beauty of that solution.
And that's happening in Singapore today. And I think that's the other thing. I meet a lot of broadcasters around Southeast Asia, and they're talking. A lot of the talk with some of the broadcasters is kind of the future tense, and I'm kind of, guys, this is kind of present tense, So, are you going to? When are we going to see you in Asia again?
You know me, I'm an evangelist, right? So the next time someone invites me to come and evangelize, I'll be back to evangelize with great pleasure. It's a long way to come, but it's a great honor at the same time. So.
Michel Proulx, the honor was mine.
All right,
thank you very much indeed, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.